Welcome to Our Canada, Our Future. I'm Aaron Woodrick. On today's show, we're going to be talking about Canada's falling fertility rates and why it's not something that a lot of people are talking about in public. And to do that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Rahim Mohammed. He's a writer and former lecturer at Wake Forest University, now affiliated with the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Rahim, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Aaron. Longtime fan of MLI.
Thanks, much appreciated. Now, Rahim, you recently wrote an essay on the subject of falling fertility rates, and you talked about just how dramatic the fall in fertility rates have been in Canada, not just in Canada, but really across much of the developed world. Could you summarize what's changed in recent years?
Sure. So it's important to note that there is substantial variation across the developed world. So you look across developed countries, you can go all the way from Israel, where the average woman has more than 3 children, to South Korea, where the birth rate is at less than 1 child per woman. So generally speaking, there's an inverse correlation between economic development and fertility. Generally speaking, for a number of reasons, as countries become more well off and as they become more urbanized, children move from becoming economic assets to economic liability. And there are a number of economic factors that drive birth rates downward. That being stated, there is a lot of variation between a country like Israel and countries like Italy, South Korea, Japan. A lot of those are driven by policy choices.
Okay, and to be clear, when we talk about variation, we're still talking about what they call below replacement level, right? The replacement level is, I believe, something about 2.1 or 2.2, and most of the developed world countries now are far below that, sort of in the range of 1.2, 1.3, and even under 1 in some cases.
So Israel is still a good deal above replacement rate. France is, right at replacement rate. There are a few countries, New Zealand, Ireland, that are at replacement rate or close to it, but you are seeing a downward trajectory. So across the OECD, the average is 1.6 births per woman, but you do see a pretty dramatic bifurcation between countries that are on the higher end of sort of closer to the replacement rate and countries that are on the lower end. And Canada in recent decades has moved to the bottom half. So we've moved to a cohort that includes countries like Italy and Japan, countries that are already dealing with effects of the so-called silver tsunami of population aging.
Interesting. And this is a recent change for Canada, as you say, joining the ranks of countries like Japan, which is already, the population is already shrinking there. So, what is your theory as to what's caused this shift in attitude, shift in fertility?
So what drove me to write the article is, and what concerns me the most about Canada, is Canada over the past decades, and this is before the COVID accelerated things, but Canada over the past few decades has decoupled from the other countries in the Anglosphere, from countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland. Those countries are still between 1.7 births per woman and replacement rate. If you look at Canada, Canada's replacement rate, since the beginning of the 21st century has lagged the other English-speaking countries, the other Anglosphere countries, if you will. And through COVID, it's gone to a record low of 1.4 births per woman. And if you look at the literature in demographics, 1.4 births per woman is a tipping point where demographers say, hey, we should start to be concerned about the effect of a lagging birth rate on things like our economic growth, on things like the sustainability of our social programs. So Canada has now hit that tipping point, but there hasn't been much of a conversation either at the national level or in the media about the implications this has for Canada's economic viability or economic growth and our welfare state.
Interesting. We've only got about 20 seconds here, but quickly, could you identify some of the things in the pandemic that you think may have accelerated things?
Sure. So they call the pandemic a she-cession. That was a soundbite, of course, that Justin Trudeau attempted to establish during the campaign. But essentially, the pandemic had a substantially adverse effect on working age women. that probably led to a depression somewhat in the birth rate. So the pandemic was a one-time effect, but it only exacerbated the trend.
Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking about Canada's falling fertility rates with Rahim Mohammed at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Now, Rahim, I wanted to play devil's advocate a little bit for you. You've expressed concern about falling fertility rates. I think a lot of people feel that way. But there are others that sort of say, why is this necessarily a problem? Why is it a problem if a country shrinks? So I was wondering, what is your response to that? What's so bad about our population maybe shrinking a little bit?
So as populations shrink, they place certain pressures on a country's economy. So younger workers tend to not only be more productive, but they tend to be more innovative. So it's the young kids in their 20s and 30s, that are starting Facebook, that are starting Tesla, that are responsible for not only a lot of the productivity gains in a society, but also a lot of the innovation gains in a society. So as a workforce becomes older, you have a number of pressures that are placed on economic growth, and they're coupled with the structure of most modern welfare states, which tend to cater to older citizens, as they should. But a lot of social spending is caught up in things like old age pensions, things like healthcare systems, which cater to older citizens. I think it's very important that people age with dignity. I think that's a very important liberal bedrock and a very important moral bedrock of modern society. But you get this vicious cycle where you have a smaller and smaller pool of productive workers that are supporting a larger and larger population of people who aren't working, people who are tapping in to social welfare policies and are reliant on social supports. And when you get into that situation, as we're seeing in countries like Italy, it becomes a politically and economically untenable state of affairs.
Right. Yeah, and I want to talk about Italy a little bit later on because you also wrote on that what's happening there. In terms of fewer workers, I mean, I'm guessing that really what you're saying is it's a matter of who's paying the bills. If you have more people who are retired and fewer people working, so for example, if you have 5 or 6 people working for every retiree, that has very different implications than if you only have two or three workers for every person who's retired. Correct?
Yeah, I'd agree. So in Italy, we're at the point where we have 2 people in the active labor force for every 1 retiree. So we've moved to a low fertility, low mortality society. I think it's great that people are living longer. My folks are both in their 70s. I hope they live forever. But we're getting to a point where that is putting a strain on our kind of modern welfare states.
Yeah, that's a problem of a prosperous society, right? People are living so long that we have to find the money to help support them in their older age. But I guess the interesting question then is, if this is a problem for a number of reasons, why are we not hearing more discussion about why does this seem to not really be on the radar in Canadian public policy? We don't hear a lot of discussion about falling birth rates. Why do you think that is?
I think, unfortunately, vocabulary surrounding fertility, vocabulary surrounding birth rates, it has been co-opted by these sort of racist, far right, sort of great replacement type movements, these sort of white nationalist movements. So even mainstream politicians are, I think, reticent to discuss the issue or touch the issue. Because they're worried about being accused of using racial dog whistles or being accused of trying to cater to that crowd.
Interesting. So maybe, and we've got about a minute here, maybe you could sort of explain this replacement theory that we hear a lot of these white supremacists that you're talking about refer to. What do they mean by this? What's the sort of story that they're trying to tell?
So replacement theory, can be cloaked in a number of different garments. There are a number of different variations, but the general thrust of this family of theories is that there's some sort of nefarious conspiracy underway to exploit the difference in birth rates among white populations and birth rates among non-white populations to ultimately attempt to export a number of non-white communities to Western countries with the end game of making white populations in these countries a minoritized and marginalized population subgroup. So a lot of this is driven by demographics in one country. So specifically in the United States of America, if you look at the U.S.'s founding, at the time of independence, 16% of Americans were Black. The United States took over about half of Mexico in 1850. So by around the middle of the century, the U.S. is expected to be a majority minority country. Demographics don't look like this in much of the West.
Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking with Rahim Mohammed at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Rahim, you were talking before the break about this white supremacist theory of replacement theory. You can see why a lot of politicians would be very reluctant to talk about fertility if those are the only other people talking about it. But setting those theories aside, why is it important that we talk about falling birth rates? What are the consequences for Canadian society if we don't take steps to change things and see fertility rates rise?
So I think it's important to think of it in terms of the rate that birth rates are falling. So across the West, we have this large bulk of baby boomers that are now en masse moving to their retirement years. And throughout the West, that is going to create strains on, social policies, on our social welfare systems, on our pension systems, on our healthcare systems. And if you have a larger pool of younger working age citizens, that's going to take some of the strain off the problem. So it's, population decline, might be a general pattern across developed countries, but it's going to be much more severe, as you said, sort of in countries where you have, 2 workers for every 1 retiree, than in countries where you have 5 or 6 workers for every 1 retiree. So, if you're able to keep the birth rate up to around replacement rate, you're going to find that sort of demographic challenge of sort of the boomer question. You're going to find that question more manageable.
Right. Now, of course, when we talk about population growth, we've only talked about birth rates, but population growth is a function of 2 elements, natural growth, which is birth rates amongst Canadians who are here, and immigration. So I wanted to get your thoughts on the interaction between, lower fertility and pressures on essentially leaning on immigration to make up the difference, and what kind of implications that has for our political debates.
So Canada has been very, very lucky with its immigration rate. And we've been very lucky with the immigrant populations we've been able to attract to Canada. At present, about 2/3 of Canadian immigrants come into Canada through skilled immigration streams. If you look globally, that is astounding. The United States would love to have that ratio. So Canada's been very lucky. We've had a surfeit of immigrants, from places like India, China, Hong Kong, the Philippines, that, can jump right into, some of Canada's most in-demand fields that come to Canada with some level of fluency in either English or France. I don't think that supply of those highly skilled immigrants, where there are very few frictions between those immigrants coming to Canada and entering the labor market at a high level, I don't think that supply is going to last forever. One, countries like China and India are themselves becoming developed and are themselves generating more demand for skilled workers. So if you look at companies like Huawei, companies like Tata, there's becoming more of a domestic demand in developing countries for talent. So a lot of the talent that comes out of those countries are going to find jobs closer to home. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing, if we see development throughout the global south and we see, skilled workers throughout the global south, sticking around in the global south instead of becoming part of the brain drain. And secondly, other countries across the West are also aging. And I think the competition for those skilled immigrants, those really kind of high-end immigrants is going to intensify among aging Western societies. So Canada has followed a formula that has worked incredibly well. It's unclear as to whether that formula can be sustained in the future. So I think in sort of all likelihood, there's going to have to be some sort of mixture between measures to increase fertility and our continued more open orientation toward immigrants. It's not an either or.
Interesting. Right, right. And that's very interesting framing when you put it that way, because it's a bit like the real estate market. Sometimes it's a buyer's market, sometimes it's a seller's market. Right now, Canada's done well. There's a lot of skilled people in other countries that want to come to Canada. Canada's given them a good deal, and it's been a win-win. But as you say, now with other countries who are also going to be very desperate to have these types of high-skilled immigrants, we really have to up our game and make sure that we're able to still be in an appealing locale for a lot of these people to move to. So fascinating stuff. I want to come back and talk a bit about some international comparisons after this short break. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking Canada's falling fertility rates with Rahim Mohammed at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Rahim, we've sort of covered why falling fertility is a problem. I wanted to turn to a very prominent international example that you wrote about recently in Italy, where who's expected to become the new Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. Her party won the most votes in the recent Italian election. How did the issues of fertility and immigration factor into her campaign?
So these issues were beneath the surface, and these issues are long-standing. So Italy, within Western Europe, it has the region's lowest birth rate. It also has the region's oldest population. It has the world's second oldest population behind Japan. It also has one of the world's most generous pension schemes. So the average pension replacement rate in Italy is 92%. So you have this entire generation of millennials who are not that young anymore. Most of us now are well into our 30s. They haven't seen, tangible improvements to their situation through their entire adult lives. They haven't really seen evidence through mainstream politics that things are getting any better. So, the average Italian lives with their parents until they're 30. The average Italian in their 30s makes about 20% less than their parents did. So you're seeing young people, among other population groups in Italy that have been excluded, disengage en masse from mainstream politics and gravitate toward more anti-system parties like the Brothers of Italy, which is the party that Meloni is set to lead.
Interesting. So what do you see in terms of parallels, both amongst the Canadian public and the sentiments that maybe Meloni tapped to in Italy? And then secondly, for Canadian politicians, do you see anyone in the Canadian political scene that may be thinking of attempting sort of a similar narrative as Meloni in order to try and win power here?
So I believe in Canada, you can fact check this, but I believe in Canada, millennials are now the largest demographic of voters. They certainly are in the United States. And despite their, despite our relative numeracy among the population, you don't really see until recently politicians responding to issues that are pressing among millennials. So a big one here in Canada is housing. A big one is, me at the age of 35, it's a lot more challenging for me to afford a house in a major urban center, than it was for my parents back in the 1990s. So it's only recently that you've seen politicians. A big example is Pierre Poilievre. Another example is the municipal elections in Vancouver in the Lower Mainland that took place over the weekend. It's only recently that you've seen politicians address these issues. And when they've addressed these issues, it's been from more of a populist bent. It's been from more of, mainstream politics has left millennials behind. What do you have to lose? It's been more of a sort of anti-system, anti-mainstream politics that seems to be, tapping into a lot of the justifiable anger that's out there among millennials.
Okay. We've got a bit more than a minute left, and I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned Pierre Poilievre. Do you see a parallel between him and Giorgia Meloni? Meloni's been called sort of far right and racist. Do you think that's true of the pitch that Mr. Poilievre is making as well?
Not at all. So Mr. Polyev is pro-immigrant. He has a mixed family. So he's married to a Venezuelan immigrant. A good number of his family is Latino. So not at all. I mean, his policies toward immigration are quite open and quite pro-immigration. But I do think he's targeting a similar portion of the population using similarly populist rhetoric. Where I see a difference between Meloni and Polyev, and where I've been somewhat critical of Polyev, is Polyev has been conspicuously silent on family-oriented policies. So policies that are directed toward young families. So things like family allowances, things like childcare. Polyev still hasn't said what he'll do with Justin Trudeau's $10 a day childcare agreements. So it's there's been a silence on those policies. Whereas with Meloni, her slogan was "God, Country, Family." So we know exactly where she stands.
Right, fair enough. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. It's a very important issue that I agree needs a lot more airing. So I want to thank you, Raheem, for participating today, and thank you, the audience. We'll see you next time on Our Canada, Our Future.